The conflict between Israel and Palestine is one of the longest and most difficult disputes in recent history. It gets attention from all over the world and makes people feel very strongly. A big part of this conflict is the struggle of the Palestinian people, especially those living in Gaza. They face many hardships because of Israeli control. People say that human rights are being violated, and even war crimes are happening. This demands that the world pays attention and that those responsible are held accountable. But the major news outlets in the West often don't seem to report on these issues very much. This makes people wonder if the news is being honest and fair. It's really important that we understand why Western media doesn't show more of what the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, are doing to Palestinian civilians. If we understand this, we can make the world a fairer and more informed place. This isn't just about how the news works. It's also about big ideas like international law, what's right and wrong, and how different countries have power over each other. By looking closely at this topic, we can see how complicated news reporting really is and how it changes what people think and what governments do. As these conflicts continue and new things happen, the news becomes even more important in shaping the story. When the news chooses only to report certain things or not report things at all, especially about serious problems, it can affect relationships between countries, how much aid they give, and what the public thinks. So, figuring out why Western media doesn't show more of what the IDF is doing in Gaza is not just something we should do now, it's something we do to make sure people are held responsible and justice is served. Why does the Western mainstream media often avoid showing footage of blatant violations of international laws and war crimes filmed by the Israeli Defense Forces against civilians in Palestine, especially in Gaza? This central question underpins a myriad of discussions surrounding media bias, political influence, and ethical journalism. The phenomenon of media outlets choosing to downplay or omit certain narratives has far-reaching implications, particularly in conflict zones where human rights abuses are rampant, and visibility is crucial for international intervention and support. At its core, this question challenges the integrity and objectives of Western media organizations. Are these entities genuinely committed to unbiased reporting, or are they swayed by political, economic, and ideological pressures? The reluctance to air footage that depicts the harsh realities faced by Palestinian civilians raises suspicions about the motivations behind editorial decisions. It provokes a deeper inquiry into the relationships between the media, government entities, and influential lobbying groups that might shape these narratives. The implications of this question extend beyond just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It invites a broader examination of how media coverage, or the lack of it, can perpetuate injustices and hinder the global community's understanding of critical issues. By dissecting this reluctance, we can better grasp the role of media in either perpetuating or challenging power structures and biases within international relations. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict coverage by Western media is complex, involving media bias, government pressure, and advocacy influences. These factors shape perceptions, policy decisions, and public attitudes. Media bias often minimizes Palestinian suffering. Advocacy groups influence media narratives. Ethical concerns deter graphic coverage. Balancing transparency and accountability is crucial. Media bias, often subtle and insidious, operates under the guise of objectivity, creating a distorted lens through which audiences perceive global events. While most mainstream media outlets profess a commitment to unbiased reporting, the reality is far more nuanced. The selection of which stories to cover, how they are framed, and what perspectives are presented inevitably reflect underlying biases that influence public opinion. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict serves as a prime example of how media bias can shape narratives. Western media often portrays Israel as a democratic state defending itself against terrorism, while Palestinians are frequently depicted as aggressors or their suffering is minimized. This framing ignores the historical context of the conflict, the power imbalance between the occupier and the occupied, and the legitimate grievances of the Palestinian people. The illusion of objectivity is further reinforced by the language used in reporting. Terms like targeted killings sanitize extrajudicial assassinations, clashes downplay asymmetrical warfare, and disputed territories obfuscate the reality of occupation. Such language choices, whether conscious or unconscious, shape public perception and legitimize one side's narrative over the other. Moreover, the sources chosen to provide expert commentary or eyewitness accounts also contribute to media bias. Relying heavily on Israeli officials or pro-Israel analysts while giving less airtime to Palestinian voices creates an imbalance that reinforces the dominant narrative. This lack of diverse perspectives prevents audiences from forming a comprehensive understanding of the conflict's complexities. Section 3. The influence of power dynamics on media coverage. Media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is shaped by global power dynamics, with Western governments and pro-Israel lobbying groups exerting significant pressure. This influence leads to censorship and self-censorship, hindering balanced reporting. The US-Israel alliance creates a climate where media may avoid jeopardizing this relationship. Pro-Israel lobbying groups monitor media and exert pressure to conform to pro-Israel narratives. This results in a media landscape filtered through a pro-Israel lens, perpetuating misinformation. Section 1. The complex relationship between governments and the media. The relationship between governments and the media is inherently complex, characterized by a delicate dance between the need for a free press and political maneuvering. Governments rely on the media to disseminate information but also seek to control the narrative, especially on sensitive issues. This dynamic is evident in the Western media's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often leading to a skewed portrayal of events. Western governments, particularly the United States, have historically supported Israel, both politically and militarily. This alliance stems from strategic interests, historical ties, and domestic political considerations. As a result, media outlets often avoid reporting that could jeopardize this relationship or cast Israel in a negative light. This pressure can manifest in various forms, shaping editorial decisions and influencing news coverage. One way governments exert influence is through the control of information. Access to conflict zones, particularly in Gaza, is tightly controlled by the Israeli military, making it difficult for journalists to independently verify information. This reliance on official Israeli sources can lead to a biased narrative. Moreover, governments can use their economic and regulatory power to influence media organizations. Public broadcasters may face funding cuts if their coverage is deemed critical of government policy. Private media companies may also self-censor to avoid backlash from governments or influential lobbying groups. The influence of pro-Israel lobbying groups on Western governments, particularly in the United States, is significant. These groups employ tactics to promote pro-Israel narratives and silence dissenting voices. Their impact influences editorial decisions and public discourse. AIPAC is one of the most powerful pro-Israel lobbying groups in the United States. AIPAC wields considerable influence in Washington, D.C. The organization actively lobbies for pro-Israel policies. These lobbying groups often employ tactics beyond traditional lobbying efforts. They actively monitor media coverage for perceived bias against Israel. Journalists critical of Israel may face accusations of anti-Semitism. This creates a chilling effect on media coverage. The influence extends to universities, think tanks, and cultural institutions. Speakers critical of Israel may face protests and boycotts. Academics may find their funding sources threatened. This influence marginalizes dissenting voices and maintains the dominant narrative. The fear of backlash creates a chilling effect on media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This fear often leads to self-censorship, avoiding certain aspects of the conflict. This self-censorship hinders a comprehensive understanding of the conflict's complexities. Journalists face a difficult dilemma. They must report truthfully while avoiding potential consequences. This can lead to avoiding certain stories or downplaying perspectives. The fear of being labeled anti-Semitic is a potent form of censorship. Criticism of Israeli policies is often conflated with anti-Semitism. This tactic silences legitimate debate and discourages journalists. The impact of this self-censorship is significant. It creates an information vacuum, silencing certain perspectives. This leads to a distorted understanding of the conflict, perpetuating stereotypes and hindering efforts for a just solution. The use of graphic imagery in reporting on conflicts, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, presents a profound ethical dilemma for journalists. There's a moral imperative to expose the brutal realities of war and a responsibility to protect audiences from gratuitous violence. Showing raw consequences of conflict can galvanize public opinion and spur demands for accountability. However, the decision to publish graphic imagery should never be taken lightly. Sensationalizing violence can desensitize audiences and trivialize suffering. Media organizations must carefully weigh the potential harm against the potential good. They must strive to find a balance between informing the public and protecting the vulnerable. Always err on the side of caution and compassion. Section 2. Protecting the vulnerable. The ethics of reporting on victims of conflict. Reporting on victims of conflict requires utmost sensitivity and adherence to ethical principles. Journalists must obtain informed consent from victims before sharing their stories or images. This involves explaining the potential consequences and respecting their right to refuse. Journalists must be mindful of the potential for re-traumatization. Avoid pressing for details individuals are not ready to share. Ethical reporting requires seeing individuals as human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and protection. Avoid sensationalism and ensure stories are told with accuracy and fairness. Section 3. Navigating legal minefields, defamation, incitement, and the limits of free speech. Reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict often requires navigating a complex web of legal constraints. Defamation laws can be used to silence critical reporting. Governments may threaten legal action against journalists or media organizations. Incitement laws can restrict reporting on the conflict. The definition of incitement or hate speech can be highly subjective. Journalists must navigate these legal minefields while upholding their responsibility to report truthfully. This requires a thorough understanding of the relevant laws and a commitment to press freedom. Section 1. The power of advocacy, shaping narratives, influencing policy. Advocacy and lobbying groups play a powerful role in shaping public discourse and influencing policy decisions. Pro-Israel advocacy groups, often well-funded and highly organized, operate with considerable influence. They promote narratives that portray Israel in a positive light. These groups often cultivate close ties with politicians and organize grassroots movements. Their influence extends to the media landscape, where they monitor news coverage and counter unfavorable narratives. This constant pressure creates a chilling effect on media organizations. Understanding their tactics and impact is crucial for deciphering media coverage complexities. Section 2. Tactics and strategies. How pro-Israel groups exert influence. Pro-Israel advocacy groups employ a wide range of tactics to shape public opinion and influence media coverage. They actively monitor media coverage for any perceived bias against Israel. These groups produce pro-Israel content and engage in public relations campaigns. They organize speaking tours and fund educational programs. They utilize legal avenues to silence criticism and stifle dissenting voices. These legal challenges create a chilling effect on individuals and organizations. Understanding these tactics is essential for recognizing the invisible hand shaping narratives. Section 3. Countering the narrative. The challenges of balanced reporting. Achieving balanced reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict presents unique challenges. Journalists often face accusations of bias from both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups. Accessing reliable information from diverse sources is difficult. The historical baggage and emotional weight of the conflict often cloud objectivity. Media organizations must prioritize journalistic integrity over sensationalism. Invest in training and support for journalists covering the conflict. Commit to fact-checking, source verification, and challenging dominant narratives. Section 1. The Historical Legacy, the Holocaust and Western Guilt. The Holocaust significantly influences media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Western nations' historical guilt fosters empathy for the Jewish people. This often manifests as unquestioning support for Israel. The Holocaust serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred. However, historical guilt can be exploited to stifle criticism of Israel. Recognize that historical guilt cannot justify human rights abuses. The lessons of the Holocaust should not be misused to perpetuate injustice. Section 2. Strategic Alliances, Geopolitical Interests and the Importance of Israel. Support for Israel stems from strategic alliances and geopolitical interests. Israel occupies a pivotal position in the Middle East. The United States views Israel as a crucial asset in the region. Israel's military prowess and strategic location make it invaluable. This strategic alliance influences media coverage of the conflict. Western media often prioritize narratives that align with this alliance. Shared enemies further strengthen this strategic bond. The enduring relationship between Israel and Western powers is cemented by military aid, trade, and technology collaboration. This interdependence raises concerns about media objectivity in covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The U.S. provides billions in military aid to Israel, benefiting both nations' defense industries. This aid bolsters Israel's military and supports the U.S. defense industry. Israel and Western nations engage in robust trade, especially in technology and agriculture. Israel, the startup nation, attracts Western investment in tech and innovation. These economic ties make it less likely for Western entities to criticize Israel. Media coverage can be influenced by economic interests. Media may avoid content critical of Israel to protect economic relationships. Positive narratives often overshadow the economic hardships faced by Palestinians. This selective focus distorts the realities on the ground. The lack of comprehensive and unbiased coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly the plight of civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, represents a failure of the Western media. This failure is not merely a journalistic shortcoming, but a moral one, with far-reaching consequences for millions. We must demand better, challenge presented narratives, and seek diverse perspectives to form informed opinions. Recognize our roles in either reinforcing or challenging these narratives. Do we passively consume biased information or actively seek alternative voices and demand accountability? The urgency for change stems from the immediate suffering inflicted upon the Palestinian people. When one side's narrative dominates, it creates fertile ground for misinformation and injustice. It is time for a paradigm shift, recognizing the shared humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians. This shift requires critical examination of information, challenging biases, and amplifying marginalized voices. Breaking free from biased media narratives requires a conscious effort to look beyond the headlines and engage with diverse perspectives. Independent media outlets play a crucial role in challenging dominant narratives and providing a platform for marginalized voices. Social media platforms allow those directly impacted by conflict to share their stories globally. Navigating this information requires critical thinking and fact-checking. Only through conscious engagement can we form truly informed opinions and challenge injustice. Achieving peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict requires a shift in media reporting. Media must prioritize accuracy, fairness, and marginalized voices. It should hold all parties accountable, regardless of alliances. Responsibility lies with journalists, editors, and media organizations. Invest in training and support for journalists. Challenge those in power and ask tough questions. Recognize the shared humanity of Israelis and Palestinians. Amplify voices of Palestinian activists and human rights defenders. Engage with Israeli voices critical of their government. Media should shape a more just and peaceful world. Understand its power to inform, challenge, and inspire. Amplify marginalized voices and hold the powerful accountable.